I will speak, hello everybody, I'm in a different role now. I will speak in English, but I can speak in Czech during discussion. Pokud chcete, když bude jako čas na tu diskuzi, já můžu shrnout, o čem budu mluvit v angličtině, nebo můžete se zaptat ve češtině a já se budu snažit odpovědět ve češtině taky. So at the beginning, I would like to say a few words about myself, about the context of what I'm going to say today. First of all, I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist who studies social and cultural anthropology, and I finished psychology faculty of philosophy in University of Sarajevo in Bosnia. And my final paper, or my final thesis in my psychology class was about anti-psychiatry movement and the phenomenology of schizophrenia, which I'm going to say in details today. So this is just about the context. And another interesting maybe thing is that my mentor was philosopher, not psychologist. So it's a little bit critical thesis, not against psychology, but against what we have been taught in psychology nowadays. Psychology and psychiatry. So during my studies in psychology, I was so unhappy, even depressed, what we have learned, what is psychology all about, because I thought when I started to study psychology that it is humanistic studies or humanistic science, that it's about human variety or human people and emotions, and all we taught was, well, not all, but majority of what we taught is about classification, diagnosis, and statistics. And I was really unhappy about that, so I was in my third year, and I didn't know if I'm going to finish faculty or start study something else. So I started, and I was really depressed, by the way, because was not psychology. There's no human part in the human studies in psychology. I was reading lots of books, and I found one book that changed my perspective on psychology and changed my way of looking at psychology and later on professional life, so to speak. So find a book that it's called Divided Self. Author was Ronald David Lang, and he was a psychiatrist, very modern, progressive psychiatrist who criticized psychiatry. But he described human being from within, what it's like for someone to experience, for example, psychosis or depression or etc. So there was a spark that said, okay, that brought me back to psychology, and I wanted to pursue that, and I wanted to study that as a psychologist, and later on as a psychotherapist, and later on in my master degrees in social cultural anthropology, because it will be about similar things as well. So my thesis, the name of my thesis was Anti-Psychiatry Movement and the Question of Schizophrenia, Phenomenology of Schizophrenic Experience. So in the 60s, just to say a few words about social context, in the 60s, after the Second World War, there was a Cold War, Vietnamese War, Cuban Missile Crisis, and all those things, and people who grew up in those kind of environments, they wanted to be free to trust other nations, other cultures, to learn from the others, not to make war all the time, etc., etc. So there were people, not just psychiatrists and psychologists, who wanted to be free and not to feel oppressed. But there were a generation of psychiatrists who said that psychiatry did more harm than did good things in the name of the science. So if you remember that in 60s, 70s, 80s, the usual technique or approach to psychological difficulties was lobotomy, and that person who invented lobotomy had won Nobel Prize for that, which is crazy. And so it's lobotomy, electric shock, or electroconvulsive therapies, and insulin comas, and that was not humane. And it was very harmful for those people. So there were critical mass of people, psychiatrists, mainly in the UK, United States, but in other parts of Western world, who said it has to stop. Even though most of them didn't like the label anti-psychiatry because it was a label, we can say now, from a time distance, that there are two major branches. This is just for us, for two major branches of people who consider themselves anti-psychiatrists. On one side, on the left side, there are a bunch of people who said mental illnesses does not exist at all. And for example, Thomas Sass was talking about that, or representatives of social labeling theory, which we all knew from social studies. And on the other branch, on the right, there are people who say mental illnesses are reactions to unbearable life situations. So it is a normal reaction to abnormal life situation. And one of the representatives are David Lang, Franco Basaglia, and Michel Foucault, for example. And those people, the influence that, who influenced those people, that was amongst the other Foucault, Goffman, and existential philosophers such as Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, Paul Tillich, etc., etc. So those bunch of, so to speak, bunch of psychiatrists and psychologists, they wanted to know the experience and phenomenology of psychiatric or psychological states from within, so in order that they can describe them to the common folk, to the common people, so that we are not afraid of that. Because all those psychiatric difficulties or psychological difficulties we experience on some level as well. Maybe not to extreme level, but on some level as well. So I will just introduce some major personalities. Number one, person who was very, after Jung, after Freud and Jung, he was the most popular person in 60s, 70s, and 80s, which had a lot of best-selling books, movies, and theater shows played upon his life, etc., etc. His name was Ronald David Lang. He was a Scotsman, Scottish psychiatrist, who worked in a psychiatry unit and said, this is something wrong, because what we are doing to those people, we are not even asking how they are doing, do they need something. What we are doing to them, it's not humane. And we have, as doctors, we need, first of all, not to do harm, and after that, to treat them. But what we have did is do harm and treat them later, so to speak. And he was interested in the phenomenology of inner experience, and he said, his theory, he was one of the first people who described to common people and to his peers what was it like to be in a state of someone who has psychosis. And he said, there are two kind of people, so to speak. This is overview. The two kind of people: ontologically secure people who are very secure in their identity over time. That means I'm sure who I was when I was 15, and I'm sure now when I'm 40, 50 years old, etc. And there are other kind of people, ontologically insecure people, which all of us in this hall, we are at least a little bit ontologically insecure, or was. Or we were ontologically insecure in some part of our lives. So he said, for those ontologically insecure people, we are not completely sure about our identity over time. We don't know who we are, where we came from, all the time. We're not sure. We maybe have some idea, but we are not sure. So that means, in short, that I have some need, and that need during my adolescent or childhood was not met. For example, I wanted to be a ballet dancer, but because I come from Balkan, for example, this is not my story, but for example, my dad said, okay, you have to be a man, you have to watch football, you have to fight. But if I want to be ballet dancer and I want to play with, I don't know, dolls, or I want to study, I don't know, psychology instead of economics, then my need is not met. So if my need is not met 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, that means that all that I'm doing is automatically responding to the roles that other people want me to play. So I go to school, I go to football, I watch football, I fight occasionally, but my inner need was not met. So, and he said, if our need is not met outside, it has to be met inside. So we go to our fantasies in order to save our need and our authentic self. So, but if we are too much divided from our own body, because our self is always embodied, that means that we have to feel our body in order to feel ourselves. So if we are so much if we are divided so much from our body, then we became ontologically insecure person. And he said there are two kind of fears that those kind of people are afraid of. One is that when they go in the outside world, they fear of being drowned by the outside world. That means when I say my need, I will be drowned by the others. Ridicule, for example. People will laugh at me, etc. The other fear is that implosion. That means that something from within is going to change and I'm not going to be the same. And the third fear is the personalization. That means when I say my need, other people are going to look through me, not at me. So those are three basic fears that maybe we sometimes during our life felt as well. And it is interesting that those characters in horror movies, for example, that we are afraid of, they represent those states of mind. For example, vampires and Draculas, they change when surrounding change. When sun rose, they change. That is fear of drowning. Or for example, in the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that change comes from within. So Dr. Jekyll changed to Mr. Hyde, etc. Or depersonalization, for example, it is represented in the characters of zombies, which are very popular today. And we can say that zombies are popular nowadays because we are so alienated from ourselves because we use so much technique, etc., etc. That's one thing that he said. And he said that psychosis doesn't have to be always break down, it could be breakthrough. It means to come back to our authentic selves. And he also, with his colleagues, examined communication within a family, and he used the double bind theory of Gregory Bateson, which we all knew or know. And he said that when there is double bind communication in the families, there is always someone who is labeled by the rest of the family as bad. And when someone is labeled as bad, and there is a double bind communication toward that person, it's a matter of time when someone is going to, let's say, have a psychotic breakdown, because psychotic breakdown is a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. So he said that during our childhood, we have the phases good, which we obey our parents. Everything that our parents say, we say, okay, I will do that, no problem. When we are in adolescence and in teenage years, then we are bad, because we said to our parents, fuck off, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to listen to a punk or to heavy metal, not to folk music, etc. And then there is a med phase. If our parents and society does not recognize our need that saying fuck off doesn't mean fuck off, but it's really our authentic things that I'm different from you, then we can go mad. So another very important and charismatic person is Franco Basaglia. Franco Basaglia was Italian psychiatrist who worked in Gorizia and Trieste, two towns near border with former Yugoslavia in Italy. And when he started as a young psychiatrist to work in a psychiatric unit, he realized that the major problem in psychiatric institution is relationship between the doctors and patient, because there's no relationship at all. And when he was appointed director of one institution, there was wire fences in front of the psychiatric unit, which said on the gates, "Do not enter." And he, instead of those words, "Do not enter," he said, "Welcome, visit." So he opened up doors to the psychiatric unit, and he was ridiculed by the people in Gorizia and Trieste and by his colleagues, because he said, "You're making a mockery of our profession." And what he was doing was releasing or releasing those people into society. So, and he opened up therapeutic communities in the psychiatric unit. So, I, who live in the city, could come to psychiatric hospital, visit to see what is happening, maybe being part of some groups, and then go home and sleep. And nowadays, 50, 60, 70 years later, that is what we are doing in the reform of mental health, even though it's not good, but so those people are were very ahead of their time. And he actually, what he accomplished is to press Italian Parliament to have a law 180. That means 180, law 180 meant that all the major psychiatric hospitals were closed. There were only some little or small facilities remaining open. And the last point was negating the institution. I think the Shepard Hughes, the anthropologist Shepard Hughes, mentioned that term in her article, famous article. Negating the institution means that I, as a psychiatrist or psychologist, I am always on the side of the patients, not always on the side of my colleagues. Maybe sometimes I'm on the side of my colleagues, but firstly I'm on the side of my patients and clients, because I have to meet their needs. So that was his contribution, more or less. Okay. Another representative was David Cooper. David Cooper was a South African psychiatrist who lived in London, and he coined the term anti-psychiatry. And he said, we as a psychiatrist, we are living in the time where we need to enter another phase, which was psychiatry. Now it's anti-psychiatry, and we hope that it will be someday's phase called post-psychiatry, that we don't need psychiatry at all, because he said what is considered in society to be a madness, it's our authentic, creative force need to be expressed in society, understood by society, and we need, when we express our madness, so to speak, we need to find that place for that madness in society. And I think even though he had very good ideas and very good experiments, they were not considered to be serious by some people, because he was very, very rebel-like, so to speak. And you can see how he looked. And the nickname was the Beast. Another very famous psychiatrist who died, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, I don't know, he was 85 or something like that, was a Hungarian psychiatrist who lived almost all his life in the United States. And he had two very famous books, even though he had about 60 books, but two very famous books. One is Myth of Mental Illness, and another one was called Manufacturing Madness. In Manufacturing Madness, he investigated parallels between witch hunt and the psychiatric patients, and he said always society needs the others in order to gain control in the society. So church needed witches in order to maintain their power, and we in modern society, we need the crazy ones, as Foucault said, in order to maintain the social order as we like it, or as we want it to be. That's one thing. And the other thing, he said that there are two kind of quote-unquote diseases. One is the disease of the body, where we can see with our tests or ultrasounds or something like that, MRIs, etc. We can see where is the sign of that illness, or what is the reason that we have some illness. When we break a leg, we have we know why we break a leg or what is the matter. But when we talk about mental processes or psyche or soul, we don't have we don't know what is causing those kind of things. So he said, okay, there is no illness. Illness is a myth that was transferred through our stories, through our faculties, through our institutions, etc. And when we're learning in the faculties, as I did, I'm not questioning that, because it is, okay, it's mental illness, it says in the textbook, and I have to, my professor said so it's true. And he said, of course, there is no illness, but there is problems of living. That means that that those problems are real, very difficult, very hard to handle, but they are problems of living, and we need to approach them as problems of living. So those are a couple of, we don't have time to go in details, but those are a couple of very important figures, persons who are representative of those kind of approach. But the main thing that it doesn't matter who we are talking about, all of them, they say they want to fight power that medicine has. It's first thing. Another thing, that authority has to be patient, not a doctor or psychologist, it doesn't matter. So we need to free ourselves from the oppression of the institution as well. And we need to focus on experience, and we need to focus on relationship, which is very logical. And most of those anti-psychiatrists, quote-unquote, or psychiatrists in this period, they had some kind of experiments, practical experiments, not just theories, because they work in psychiatric unit. One of them was so-called Villa 21. It was part of a psychiatric institution in Western London, and it was conducted by David Cooper. And there was two groups controlled and experiment one. In one group there were people who was given diagnosis, and they were given lots of drugs, and another one they were given non-drugs, and only they had community groups, therapy groups, they were speaking to people, and only if in case of emergency some sedatives was taken. And of course, they were 3 months in that hospital, and there were year after that only 17% of people who was in that experimental group went back to a psychiatric hospital. More than 80% or 83% never came back, at least not in that year in psychiatric hospital. So they said, okay, relationship is the most important thing, and we need to understand what is happening. And the most famous experiment was the Kingsley Hall. It is a building named Kingsley Hall in London. And that experiment was conducted by Ronald David Lang for 6 years. It was very, very famous and very successful one. They didn't have codes, they didn't have names, they didn't have titles, and psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychotherapists lived with the patient who had schizophrenia or had a psychotic experience. And for 6 years, a lot of people were in Kingsley Hall, and it was very, very popular thing. Even people like, I don't know, Sean Connery or Timothy Leary went and had some kind of lectures there. And one that could be maybe interesting for Professor Livia, there were, you can say it's ethnographic film called Asylum, which was filmmakers who lived for 3 months in that Kingsley Hall and filmed authentic reactions of those people there. It was very interesting. And after that, there were several other institutions or community houses across Europe, and even they like Soteria House project over there, and even they exist nowadays as well. And the famous person, not a client or patient, but a person who lived for 2 years in Kingsley Hall, who went through madness. An important thing is that they believe that madness is a process of going back to a childhood and then regain our authentic selves in order that we express our authentic self once again. And the very popular person afterwards were Mary Barnes, who wrote a book, two accounts of journey through madness with her psychotherapist about her journey through madness. And she was a very famous painter as well. So she went through 4 phases which she described. First, that she came back to a childhood which she didn't speak for several months. And only way of communication with her psychotherapist was a non-verbal one, like a baby. And then, the next phase was that she felt some emotions, and she needed to realize that those emotions are hers, and she needs to find a way to express it. And the 4th way was where she expressed herself, and she find a very interesting way that she painted with her feces or shit. And that was very symbolic way that something what is within, inside, came outside, and people was okay with that, even though it was very extreme, of course. And 14, that she accepted her new role as Mary Barnes, the artist. And there are several plays that was played as her biography plays. And post-psychiatry, of course, psychiatry movement was the zeitgeist or spirit of time, doesn't exist anymore, those people are dead, etc. But those kind of questions still exist, were not resolved, and those kind of problems still exist in our society. And there are lots of different kind of networks or NGOs or people who are talking about alternative way to see mental health. One of those are, for example, psychiatrists who consider themselves post-psychiatrists. They said, I am psychiatrist, but we don't need a psychiatry as an institution. Other are Hearing Voices Network, which is a topic of my thesis in social and cultural anthropology, which is a group of people worldwide, network or movement of people who hear voices, and they want to say that hearing voices is a common human experience, and we want to emancipate ourselves. If I hear voices doesn't mean that I'm crazy. And there are, for example, radio shows that are conducted and edited by people who had psychiatric experience, and I helped create 5 of those radio stations in Western Balkan as well, which I'm very proud of. So, I'm aware the time is running, or I'm already done my part. Yeah, 2 minutes. Tak, yeah. No. Tak. So the most important thing is that those questions are still remain open. Do I have a right to choose treatment or not? What does it mean to be mentally ill or crazy or abnormal? Those questions are still open for debate. Who says that someone is crazy or some behavior is abnormal, etc., etc. So this is very interesting for me personally, even though I didn't have any experience with psychosis or deep depression or something like that. But I'm very interested in those kind of phenomena because I think that every one of us has potentiality or potential to experience extreme states of mind like psychosis or deep depression, etc., etc. And some people say that all of us here, for example, heard voices sometime in their lives, for example. If we ask ourselves, how is that possible? We can ask ourselves, did we had experience, for example, that we thought that our mobile phone was ringing even though it didn't ring? And if we said yes, then we heard a voice, even for a second, for example. Or if we saw a person who died, for example, dear person who died, and we know that that person is dead, but in a moment, in a second, we saw that person on the Hlavní nádraží, for example, or some kind of railway station, even though we know that it is not possible to see her. That means that in 1 second we had a hallucination or a delusion. So that means that it is a part of our being, a human being, so to speak. So this is all for me. We will have 10 minutes for questions or discussion, and tak. No? Chcete, můžu něco shrnout ve češtině, nebo se zeptat česky?
Každopádně děkujeme za příspěvek a teď je teda čas k diskuzi.
In English?
Yeah, yeah. English.
The speech was in English, let's try.
Let's try.
You have shown us the two books by Lane.
Yeah.
One was Divided Self, and the other, you showed more books, but I noticed two which I read, but I don't remember them much.
Yeah.
And the other was the Knots.
Yeah.
So my question, which is a book of poems, which shows somehow the loops, the tracks of language.
Yeah.
So my question is, what is the connection between, so to say, more existential position of Lane, which is probably Divided Self, and more pragmatic, Wittgenstein-like work with the language? Can you see, are these two phases, or is it somehow connected? Conceptual thinking and existential interpretation.
Yeah. Round Lang was very, very fascinated person, and there's a lot of biographies and movies. Even last year there was a motion picture about his life in the UK, and he was very famous, as I said, most famous after Jung and Freud. But when people study his life, he said, and I know some people who was pupils of Lang, for example, that lucky, so to speak. And he said there are three phases in his creative professional life, so to speak. First one was that existential one, when he was focused on the inner, subjective, phenomenological experience of psychosis, of schizophrenia or madness, of whatever, in order that we, as a common folk, understand what is happening inside of that people, even though we can't understand the communication when we communicate face to face. But it is important that we know what is going on inside. And even if someone can't speak, we don't understand him, it doesn't mean that he don't want to speak, but he can't express himself or herself. That's the first phase. And second phase was when he studied interrelational communication, what is happening when we communicate inside of a family or inside of a small group or a society, and how does the family or the myths of the family or the stories that are in the family influence our own personal life. For example, if we can imagine that, as I said, if we have a family and every family has a myth of their own that transfers from generation to generation, that, I don't know, our family was strong, hardworking, we didn't have any gay people, and we didn't have any ballet dancers, you know, etc., etc. So you have to continue that. And in order that someone is a part of a group, that means that I have some use from that group, that group reflects my identity. But what happens when that group doesn't reflect my identity, you know, for example? And he said that what happens in order that family survive and has a myth of their own, family unconsciously, of course, label that person, that son or daughter, that is mad or different, and family goes with that story with psychiatrists and psychologists who officially label that person, and then myth of that family or that group is saved. That's the second phase. And the third phase is a little bit experimental, shamanic even, when he went to Ceylon to meditate in the caves, and when he experimented with different kind of ways of writing, like in Knots. Knots was a poems, where he tried to capture in language paradoxical communication between psychiatric patients, those labeled ones, and normal ones. So those, I don't know, I hope that I answer your question. And the most famous book, who was bestseller, was Politics of Experience, which I didn't talk about it, which is very political and a rebel one. And he spoke basically that we are oppressed by society, by the rules and institution, and they don't allow us to be authentic. Very short.
Yeah, may I ask one more question? You mentioned the authentic self, so to say. How did they understand the authentic self? Because when you come back to your biography, to your history, is it authentic? Isn't it also somehow constructed? in psychotherapy it doesn't matter, because if it's a process of healing, it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. But what did they mean with the concept of authentic self? Childhood or?
It could start, of course, it starts in childhood, but in short, I would say that it is that feeling that when you're doing something, you know that you are one that is doing that, and you feel fine, you feel present, you feel embodied. That means that when I'm doing that, I feel in whole of my body that I am that who is doing that, and this is the right thing, because I'm not automatically doing something. For example, if I would work in a bank, I would automatically doing that stuff, and I would be maybe good at it, I don't know. But I will feel that is not something that I want to do. And that's why the body is very important, which is, Merleau-Ponty said wrote lots about that. So we need to feel in our body that we are here and present. And those people who are divided from body, they become no body. As it said in English, they become no body, no? Because they're not connected with their bodies. Or no thing, because they are no nothing.
So the authentic self is not a kind of concept, because many people think that authenticity means some values of mine or the ideologies which I share, but it's a feeling, as you said.
I think I would say that it is a feeling. That would be my short answer. Even though it could be influenced by different kind of things, of course, culture.
Děkujeme Hadimu za příspěvek.